Hi there, welcome to this course on your first Java web application in 25 steps. I am Ranga Karnam. I have more than a decade's experience in developing Java web applications. In this course, I will take you through a series of 25 steps which would help you in creating a simple web application with login logout functionality and also to-do management functionality. During this course, we would touch upon the basic concepts of Java web application development: request, response, get, post, servlets, JSP, EL, filters. We use HTML5 and Bootstrap to style our web application, and we use Maven to run our web application on Tomcat. To be able to follow this course, you need to have some experience with Java. I will help you install Eclipse and also to get up and running with Maven and Tomcat. All the code for this particular course is available in the GitHub repository in 28 minutes, Java web application step by step. This repository contains the code at the end of each step of our tutorial, starting from step 1 to step 25. What are we waiting for? Let's create our first web application together in 25 steps. In this course, we would be using Eclipse as the IDE. If you don't have Eclipse already installed, then you can use complete installation guide for Java and Eclipse including Maven, which is present in our GitHub repository. If you go into Java web application step by step, this is where you end up. So this is the GitHub repository, and if you go further down in here, there is a PDF link. So if you open this guide up, it would help you to install Java, Eclipse, and also Maven. In this course, we would use the embedded Maven inside Eclipse. So you don't need to separately install Maven. All that you would need is to install Java and Eclipse. Once you have it ready, we are ready to go. Before we discuss any theory about web application, let's get our hands dirty and also start with creating our first step. By the end of this step, you would have a simple web application running in Tomcat. Let's get started. The simplest way to create a web application in Eclipse is by saying right click, new, other, and type in Maven. We would say Maven project. Maven is a Java build tool, and it helps us to manage all the dependencies for our web application. It's quite a simple tool if you understand it correctly. And if you create a web application as a Maven project, it brings in a huge deal of benefits which we will make use of during this course. So let's go ahead and click next, Maven project, and I would create a very simple project. I don't want to use archetypes. Archetypes are Maven's way of creating sample projects. In this particular course, I don't want to use archetypes because we want to configure each step ourselves. We want to do this course step by step. So I would create the web application step by step. So I choose create a simple project. I would say use default workspace location. Once I say use default workspace location, Eclipse would use the same workspace to store all the code. That's not a problem. So go ahead and use default workspace location and click next. Any Maven project that we create needs to have a name. A name consists of two parts. One is group ID, the other one is artifact ID. Group ID is like package name. So I give in something like com.in28 minutes. That's what we are giving as group ID. And the artifact ID, it's our first web application. So I would say first web application. The version, don't really worry about it. Leave it at default. Packaging, I would change it to var. We want to create a web application. A web application is var. var stands for web archive. JAR stands for Java Archive. So we want to create a var, a web archive. We want to create a web application. So I choose a var. So I'll now go ahead and click finish. Eclipse would take a while before it creates the first project. Once it's up and running, we can get started. Once you open up the project which was created, the first web application, you would see all the folders that you see on the screen right now. The important folders are source, main, Java. Source main Java is where we would put in all the Java resources. So whatever is shown as Java resources in here, the most important folder is source main Java. Source main resources consists of all the resources that we need as part of the source file. So if you need a properties file or if you need a XML file, you would put it in source main resources. We would not create any test code during this particular course. So you don't need to really worry about source test Java. But if you are interested in unit testing and you create unit tests, these are the folders where you would create those unit tests. Other than this, you'd see a deployment descriptor. Right now, if you double click on any of these, you'd see a message saying the web.xml does not exist. Don't worry about it. We would create a web.xml very soon. And also, you'd see a pom.xml. So if I open the pom.xml, you'd see just a little bit of configuration. I mean, the group ID which we created, which we gave as input, and the artifact ID and the version. All these were the inputs which we provided in the IDE earlier, and these were used to create a pom.xml. A pom.xml is the most important component which is used by Maven. Maven is a Java dependency management tool. To run a web application, you need a lot of jars. For example, if I'm running a web application with Spring Hibernate, then I need spring.jar, hibernate.jar. Instead of myself going individually and downloading each of the jars, I can ask Maven to download the jars for me. This work which Maven does is called dependency management. Once we add a dependency in pom.xml, Maven would automatically go and get it from a repository and make it available for this project. We will use this feature of Maven extensively during this particular application. Maven is quite a very simple tool to understand, and it makes the life of a web developer very, very easy. As a student, I really hate courses where I'm asked to copy a lot of stuff. I really like to do things step by step. I kind of give an exception to that rule in this first step alone. In my experience, I saw many students make error in the first step and unable to recover from it. So in this first step alone, we would copy 3 files from the repository. We would spend a lot of time analyzing them, but we would copy them for this step alone. The first file we would copy is pom.xml. So I would start from here and select the entire content of the file, copy it, and open up the pom.xml that we have and paste it in. There are 2 important things that we would need to discuss about this pom.xml, which we will discuss very soon. That's pom.xml, the first file that we copied. The second file that we want to create is the login servlet.java. So what I'll do is I'll copy this entire code, Control C, so right click, copy, and you can paste it directly in source main Java. So you can go to source main Java and say right click, paste. There will be a few compilation errors which would be coming up. Don't worry about them right now. The last file which we will copy is the web.xml. It's in a folder called web.inf. So what I'll do is I'll create a folder called web.inf. So in web app, I'll create a new folder called web.inf, and in here I'll also create a new XML file. I'd want to call this smallweb.xml, and I'll copy the content from here in there. So I'll copy whatever is in here into this. Effectively, there are 3 files that we have created. The first one is the pom.xml. In the pom.xml, we copied the content in, we created a login servlet, and we copied in the web.xml. These are the 3 files that we copied in. I'm sure this would be one of the last times we copy the entire file during this course. After you copied in the files, you can do a right click, Maven, update project. We have done a few Maven changes and we need to update those changes. So we do right click, Maven, update project. You'd see that all the errors disappear, and now we have a complete web application configured. Before we look into the actual content of the pom.xml, login servlet.java and web.xml, let's try and run this application. There's a lot of magic that we created in these 3 small files that we added in. Let's see what that magic is right now. So I'm doing right click, run as Maven build, and you can type in Tomcat 7. So there's a plugin called Tomcat 7 that we configured. We'll look into very soon, and say run. Tomcat 7 : run. So it's Tomcat 7 : run, and click run. You'd see a lot of things happening in the console. You'd see that there are a lot of files getting created, and also the Tomcat server would be started. Now the Tomcat server is running, and it also is printing the URL in here. So if you look it in console, there would be somewhere it says http://localhost:8080 or whatever port you are using. Let's launch up a browser and type in localhost:8080 and press enter. You would see some response coming back. It says my first servlet and the heading is Yahoo. You might ask me, we have a servlet running printing my first servlet, but how is it really working? What is in this servlet? Who downloaded Tomcat? You have not downloaded Tomcat at all until now, right? It's running in Tomcat. How is it possible? And what is in the web.xml? Lot of questions unanswered. We will try and answer these questions in the theory part of this particular step. There are a lot of unanswered questions, but the thing you can be proud of is the fact that you have a web application running in 10 minutes flat. Now, let's try and answer your questions. First, let's look at the pom.xml. There are three things that you need to understand in the pom.xml. What we did is we ran the web application in Tomcat. How did we download Tomcat? Actually, Maven did it for us. We configured a plugin in here which is called a Tomcat 7 Maven plugin, which takes care of downloading the Tomcat and running the web application in there. So that's your first question. So to be able to run the web application in Tomcat, we use something called Tomcat 7 Maven plugin. There's another plugin which we configured in here. The second plugin which we configured in here is something called a Maven compiler plugin. Maven takes care of compiling the Java classes that we created and also building the jars and the vars. The default Java version which the compiler uses is 1.5. But I'm creating a JE6 application which needs minimum of Java 7. So I would want to configure this particular web application to use 1.7, to use the source Java source version as 1.7 and the target version also as 1.7. The way we did that is by using a plugin, a Maven compiler plugin, and in the configuration of the plugin we set source and target. The most important thing about these two plugins is the fact that once we have configured them, we are not going to change them throughout the course. So if you are not understanding them completely, it's okay. Or you might even do a Google search on Maven compiler plugin and Tomcat 7 Maven plugin to understand a little more about them. The third thing in the pom.xml that we have added in is a dependency. We are running a Java EE6 web application. How do we add the Java EE web API jar to the code? In the servlet, if you look at the servlet, this extends a HTTP servlet. The HTTP servlet is defined in JavaX servlet HTTP. We need to provide this jar to the Java application. So to this web application, we need to add the jar in. So what we did is in the pom.xml, we added that jar as a dependency. If you go and expand the libraries section, you would see in the Maven dependencies a Java EE web API.jar. And if you go in, you would see the Java x.servlet.http.http servlet defined in there. Since we want to create a servlet and we want to use Java EE, we have added in the dependency on Java EE web API. You'd see that if I remove this dependency, let's say I'm removing this dependency and I'm doing a save, you'd see that in the Maven dependencies we don't have anything right now. So we don't have anything in the Maven dependencies. The second thing which you would have is that there is a compilation error on the login servlet, because now there is no HTTP servlet class available. To create a servlet, we need to extend the HTTP servlet, but the HTTP servlet class is not available in this particular web application. The way we are adding in the Java EE API var is by adding a dependency in here. Once we add the dependency in, you would see that all the errors would disappear and we have a compiling login servlet. So that's the pom.xml. The important things in the pom.xml is we added in two plugins. The first plugin to be able to run the web application in Tomcat. The second plugin to be able to compile the code using Java 1.7, source and target as Java 1.7. The third thing we added in is a dependency on the Java EE web API. We want to make use of Java EE version 6, and we are making that jar available as a dependency to this particular project. Those are the three things which are important from the perspective of a pom.xml. The next file we would be looking at is the web.xml. In the web.xml, all that we did is we created a welcome file called login.to. Whenever somebody types in localhost 8080, we want them to go to login.to. That's what the welcome file does. Welcome file is a simple redirection. When you type in localhost colon 8080, it redirects to localhost colon 8080 slash login.do. That's all that's all the content there is in the web.xml. The other important thing which is there in the web.xml is the fact that we are using the specification version 3.0. So 3.0 is the latest version and we are using 3.0. So we are creating a web app version 3.0, and we gave a display name to this particular project as to-do list because we want to build a to-do management application. That's the web.xml. Actually, the content in web.xml is really simple compared to the content in the pom.xml. The last file which we have created in here is the login servlet. The login servlet is a servlet. What does that mean? Login servlet extends HTTP servlet. What is HTTP servlet? That is what we would discuss in the next chapter. In this course, we are creating a JEE 6 web application. JEE stands for Java Platform Enterprise Edition, and we are going to use this technology to build our web application. The best place to get all the documentation about the JEE platform is the Oracle website. So if you go to the Oracle website, the URL is in here. I mean, the simplest way to get to this would be just say JEE 6 documentation and search in Google. This would be the first result which would usually come in. Java EE is nothing but a set of specifications that define how various things are developed in Java enterprise applications. The specific thing that we are focusing on in this particular course is the Java Servlet technology. So we are going to use Java Servlets to create our web application. There are a lot of other things in the Java EE specification like JSF, JPA, Java Persistence API, JAX-RS, how do you develop REST web services with Java, and things like JMS, how do you interact using JMS, Java Messaging Service, with other applications. Our focus would be on understanding how to develop web applications using the Java Servlet technology. Now that we have a little bit of background on JEE, request, response, we are ready to answer the question, what is a servlet? A servlet is nothing but a very simple Java class which can take a request in and can respond back with a response. So a servlet takes an input as a request and gives the response as the output. That's basically what a servlet is. In this course, we are only interested in web requests, the HTTP request and HTTP response. So we are really interested in HTTP servlets. Basically the servlets which can take a HTTP request as input and a HTTP response as an output. Now let's look at our first example servlet. Before we discuss about the login servlet, let's run the web application again. I'll do a right click, run as mvn build Tomcat 7. If you already have it running, that's okay. But I have stopped it, so now I would go ahead and run it again. It takes a few seconds for the server to start up, and now I can visit the page localhost colon 88. One tip which might help you. If you get a port already in use exception, for example, I'll run, like my server is already running, so I'll go ahead and run it again. So I'll do right click, run as mvn build. So I'll choose Tomcat 7 run. So this would try and launch up the server again. I already have the server launched up, But what I'm doing is I'm trying to launch it up again. You get an exception saying JavaNet bind exception address already in use. This would not launch up the server because the port 8080 is already used by a server which is already launched up. So what you can actually do in that kind of situation is actually terminate the server first, and you can double click this arrow which is in there, and then you'd go to the server instance which is already running. If you would want, actually you can kill the server and launch it up again, or if it already has the latest code, then you can use the already running version. Let's now go to localhost 8080. What we see on the screen is my first servlet, and I also see Yahoo in here. What we would do is we want to understand what happens behind the screen for this. So what we would need to do is use right click and do inspect element. I'm using Firefox, so if you're using Firefox too, right click and do inspect element. Once we do right click inspect element, we get into the developer tools section of Firefox. There are a lot of features in here. The one which we are really interested in is network. So I would go to network and I would reload the page. So what I'll do is I'll reload the page again. What you'd see when I go to the all tab is a request fired in. I'm doing an inspect element. I would go to the network tab and reload the page again. And then you'd see something happening behind the screen. So what you are seeing in here is what is called a GET request. This is how the web applications work, irrespective of the technology they use behind the screen. What they do is they use something called a request. So when we typed in localhost colon 8080, what the browser does is it creates a request and sends a request to this particular server. It sends a request to localhost 8080. What kind of request? It's a GET request. We'll understand the difference between GET and a POST a little later. But in this particular situation, what we are sending is a GET request to the request URL localhost colon 8080. Along with the request, a few request headers are also sent. If you looked at it here, it shows the browser I am using, Mozilla 5.0. And there are a few other parameters which are sent along with the request headers. That's not really important for you, but you need to understand that there is something called request headers. When we typed in localhost 8080, we are actually creating a GET request to localhost 8080, and along with the GET request, there are a few request headers which are sent in. That's the request. Now, what was the response that came back? I would go and click the response, which is the fourth tab on my screen right now, and the response you see is a HTML. So you'd see that there is some HTML coming back from the server. So when the server got this request, when the server got the HTTP request, localhost 8080, what it did is it responded back with this particular response. What does the response contain? The response contains very simple HTML. HTML, it contains a little bit a title, and it contains a little bit of body, which we see on the screen right now. So my first servlet is inside the body, and Yahoo is the title, and that's what you see in here. So when the server got the request, when the web server got the request localhost 8080, it responded back with a response. So this is a HTTP request and this is a HTTP response. Along with the response also, there are a few headers which are sent back. So if you see what is the date, what is the time on this server, and what is the type of server, what is the length of the response that's returned back. Those are the response headers which are returned back from the server. So if we look at it at a high level, it's very simple. When I type in localhost 8080, the browser creates a GET request to localhost 8080 along with a few request headers. The request goes to the server and the server is responding back with a HTTP response which contains the HTML content as well as a few headers on the response. This is how all the web applications work. You can try this on other websites too. You can probably go to google.com and see what's happening in the background. You can go to other websites and see what's going to the background, and you would see a lot of requests and responses happening in the background. So to summarize what we have seen until now, when I type in a URL in the browser bar, the browser sends something called a HTTP request to the web server. In the specific case we were looking at, it was a GET request. And the web server, once it gets the request, it responds back with a HTTP response. What we are building as part of this web application is the code in the web server. Browser sends HTTP request to web server. So what should the web server do? What should the code in the web server do? It should take, the code in the web server should take the HTTP request, it should take the HTTP request as input. So the HTTP request is a input to the code in the web server. And what is the output? The output is what does the web server needs to give back? It needs to give back a HTTP response. So the output is HTTP response. So the input to the web server code is a HTTP request, and the output from the code in the web server is a HTTP response. Let's look at the sequence of steps again. I type in a URL in the browser bar. The browser creates a HTTP request, sends it to the web server. The code in the web server, it looks at the HTTP request, and based on the content of the HTTP request, it responds back with a HTTP response. The HTTP response is sent back to the browser, and the browser would show the page. That's basically the entire flow for any web app. Let's now consider the important parts in creating a sample servlet. The servlet that we are creating in here is the login servlet. The login servlet, if you look at it, it extends the HTTP servlet. The HTTP servlet is defined in the package Java Servlet HTTP servlet. This is coming from the JEE specification. So any servlet should extend HTTP servlet. That's number one. So we extend the HTTP servlet. The second thing is, what is the URL to this servlet? So when I type in localhost 8080, we came in here. How did we come in here? We use something called a URL. The URL which is assigned to this particular servlet is login.do. To assign a URL to this servlet, we used an annotation called @webservlet. @webservlet is a new annotation in JEE 6. It's in the package Java Servlet annotation web servlet, and it helps us define the URL patterns for this particular URL. An annotation is something which adds more information onto a class. This particular class, we defined it as a HTTP servlet, but we also want to add more information onto it. We want to add the URL for it. For that sake, we use a web servlet annotation. The web servlet annotation adds more information to the login servlet. Now we are saying web servlet with a URL pattern login.do. So we are saying, how do we call the login servlet? You have to type in /login.do. Let's do this quickly. Instead of typing in localhost :8080, I would say localhost :8080 /login.do. So we typed in login.do instead of localhost :8080. So we typed in localhost :8080 /login.do. And now I see the output. So login.do is basically the URL which is used to invoke this particular servlet. Earlier, we saw that we are sending a GET request. So the request which we are sending in is of a type GET. The method, if you see, is GET request. To handle that, we need to create a doGet method. If you look at the HTTP servlet, it defines a couple of methods in here. The one which we are interested in is this particular method, doGet. The doGet method is used to handle GET requests. So we create a doGet method. So we created a doGet method which has two inputs or two parameters. The first one is the HTTP servlet request, and the output from it is the HTTP servlet response. So request is the input, response is the output. So that's what we learned earlier. For any servlet, what is the input? Request. What is the output? Response. So we read from the request and put information back in the response. That's what we do. So we created a method doGet to handle the request to login.do. What kind of request? We are going to handle the get request. That's why it's called doGet. So we are going to handle the get request to login.do, and we are going to send a response back. What we would have in the response is what we are writing in here. So we are getting a writer object from the response. So we are doing a response.getWriter and getting a printWriter object out. And from here, it's very simple thing like a system.out.println. So I'm doing an out.println, whatever content needs to be sent in the response. So I'm saying out.println, HTML, head, title. So if you look at the response back for this particular thing, if I highlight this and see the response, you'd see that the response here exactly matches what we are typing in. Whatever changes I would make in here, you'd see in the response as well. So if I go ahead and change, let's say Yahoo, I would change it. I'll remove the semicolons at the end and just say title Yahoo. Give it some time for the context to reload, and we are ready. Now I go ahead and type this again. You see that now the title is changed to Yahoo. Whatever is in this particular servlet is being returned back as the response. These are the 4 important things. First one, any servlet should extend HTTP servlet. For any servlet, I would want to give it a URL. The way we do that is by using an annotation at web servlet and passing a parameter URL patterns. In the servlet, we need to define what kind of methods I would want to handle. I would want to handle request method get or request method post. So in this example, we are looking at request method get, and we defined a doGet HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response method. In this method, request is the input and response is the output. And how did we create the response? We took the get writer and we wrote some output into the print writer. What I'll recommend you to do is try and play around with this particular servlet. Try and make changes to it. Try and change the URL. Try and change the content which is printed in. Try and play around with it for about 10 minutes to get more understanding about this particular servlet. We will discuss this servlet more in the next step and also try and create this from scratch. This has been a very long but very interesting step 1. We understood the request response flow. We understood how the browser creates the HTTP request and how the web server responds back with a HTTP response. We understood how to create our first login servlet. We looked at important things like pom.xml and web.xml, and probably you were introduced to a lot of new terminology as well. This is probably the longest and probably the most important of the 25 steps that we would discuss as part of this course. So I will really recommend you to repeat this step if you have any questions. So are we ready to move on to the next step? In this step, we will do 2 things. One is we'll create the login servlet from scratch, and the second one is we would start using a JSP instead of writing content directly from the servlet. Let's get started with the first part. I will delete the login servlet completely and stop the server as well. We now want to create a login servlet. So what I'll do is right click on the source main Java and say new class. The package I will use is, you can use anything actually. Let's use com.in28minutes, and the name we already know, it's login servlet. Click finish. The first step in creating a servlet is you need to extend. What do you need to extend? We discussed that in the previous class. You need to extend HTTP servlet, and if you type in HTTP servlet and press Control space bar, we need to do the import of HTTP servlet, and Eclipse provides an easy way of doing that. That's Control space bar. So press Control and space bar together and it would show what are the options, and I would choose the first one, so I would press enter. You would see that now this particular import is added in. So what did we import? We imported the HTTP servlet. So that's very good. That's a very good start. Now I would want to go ahead and add the URL to this. How do we add the URL? By using the annotation web servlet. So I type in at web servlet. Annotation starts with at. Web servlet is the name of the annotation. Type it in and press Ctrl space bar, and you already see that it's imported. So the web servlet is now imported. So this is the import which is used, and now to this I would want to add in a parameter for the URL. So how do I add in a URL? I put in a open bracket, close bracket, and press Ctrl space again, and it shows the options. The option I want to use is URL pattern. So I would use URL patterns and give it a value. What's the URL pattern that we want to give it to this? Login.do. Most important thing is the URL pattern should start with a slash login.do. That's the URL pattern that we are assigning to this particular servlet. Let's go ahead and now add in the next important thing, which is we want to handle the get method. So we want to handle the get request. So I'll go to the HTTP servlet class and copy this. So this is the definition which we are going to use. So I'll copy that in. This is the method which we are going to override on the HTTP servlet. So the doGet method we are going to implement. So I don't want to use the package names directly in here, so I'll remove the package name. You can press Ctrl space at the end of it and import the JavaX servlet, and similarly in here HTTP servlet request also I would want to import. One way of doing this would have been to just copy this and import that particular class. Now I don't need to do this here, so that's simple. So now we have a HTTP servlet request, HTTP servlet response. It's called arg0. I hate that. I'll call this request, and let's call this a response. Let's go ahead and also import these two classes as well. JavaX servlet, I don't need it. So I need it, but I don't need the package definition directly in the code. So I'll do Ctrl space again at the end of servlet exception. So I'll go to the end of servlet exception, do Ctrl space. So we have imported that in. Now IO exception also. Let's remove the package definition, go to the end, press Ctrl space. I would want to use the IO exception from the Java IO. That's it. We have now a simple doGet method defined. So now we want to write to the response. To be able to write to the response, we need to get a writer. So get writer. So that's the third step. So we are now getting the writer. Sorry, that's the fourth step. The third step was to define the doGet method. We have done that successfully, and now we are getting the response.getWriter. Print writer is equal to response.getWriter. You can import in the print writer as well. So it's in Java IO print writer. Writer.println, some dummy stuff. I don't really care what it is. I just want to send this back and see whether this is getting printed to the browser. It's not really a HTML response, but I don't really care. The first thing I care is whether it's working. So I'll go ahead and do a run as mvn build and choose tomcat7:run, which we used earlier. I would wait for the server to start up and refresh the browser. The URL which we gave it is login.do. Now I pressed a refresh again, and you see that dummy stuff is printed out to the console. So if I look at the get request, the response which came back is what we typed in, dummy stuff. So if I go ahead and change the response now from dummy stuff and add in one more line, dummy stuff 2, hold on to a little time until you see reloading context is completed. Once the reload is completed, the servlet is reloaded, and now I can refresh and you see dummy stuff 2. And if I look at the response, it's dummy stuff 2. Actually, this is not really a good way of doing it. The browser understands HTML, and we need to send the data which we want to show on the browser in HTML format. What I've done now is I copied a little bit of content in here. So it's HTML head title Yahoo head body /body HTML. This is a well formatted HTML. The other thing which I have done is also rename the variable. Instead of calling it writer, I called it out. So now this particular piece of code would print whatever you see on the screen. So whatever you see in the double quotes would be printed out to the browser, would be sent as a response to the browser. It's not really printing out to the browser. What happens is a request is sent, and in response you would get whatever we have in this thing. So we have exactly this in here as well. So that's how your servlet works. A servlet gets a HTTP request, we send a HTTP response back. We looked at the 4 steps in creating the servlet in here. Now let's go ahead and change this to a JSP. I know the first question is, why should we go for a JSP? Why can't we keep writing code like this? A servlet is a Java class. Java is a language where it's easy to do business logic. What we are doing in this particular servlet is trying to send some HTML content out to the browser. So we wanted to send this response out to the browser. That's not what Java is good at. Java is really good at doing business logic and not really good at sending static content out, because I have to repeat out.println so many times in here. Java EE came up with this concept of JSPs, Java Server Pages. These Java Server Pages are designed to make writing dynamic content to the web browser very easy. One important thing you need to know is even JSPs finally compile to a servlets. So even though I write a JSP, at the end the JSP would be converted to a servlet. So there is not really any performance benefit in going for a JSP, because a JSP also converts to a servlet by the end anyway. The reason why we use JSPs is that it's easier to write dynamic HTML content in a JSP rather than in a servlet. Let's go ahead and create our first JSP. Typically in a web application, we write all our Java code in source main Java, and we have all our JSPs in a folder webinf. I would want to create a folder for the views. JSP is a view, so I would create a new folder. In webinf, I'll call this views. I'll click finish and I'll create right-click new JSP file. We want to use this for login, so I would call this login.jsp. You have the first JSP file created with a lot of things in here. By default, Eclipse is generating a doc type HTML 4.0. So this is HTML4. I'll remove all the content so that it becomes HTML5. So the default is HTML5. So when I say doc type HTML, the default is HTML5. So now I have a HTML5 JSP, except that the title needs some customization. So what we want to do in the title is what we did in login servlet. So let's go ahead and put a title as Yahoo from JSP, just for us to be sure that it's coming from the JSP. So Yahoo from JSP. So now we have a simple JSP created. This follows typical HTML structure. We have very little content in the body. It just says my first JSP. The JSP is ready. In the servlet, we need to redirect to the JSP. When user hits login.do URL, we want him to go from the servlet to the JSP. We want to redirect him from the servlet to the JSP. How do we do that? The way we redirect a request to a JSP is very simple. You need to do request.get request dispatcher. So this is a get request dispatcher is a method on the request, and to this I need to pass in where the JSP is. So where is the JSP? So I need to pass in where my JSP is and forward the request to it. So I would pass in forward request comma response. Redirecting to a JSP is very simple. The first thing is you get the request dispatcher. So I get the request dispatcher and point it to where my JSP is. This particular thing is not really correct right now, so wherever my JSP is, I would need to put it in here, and I would forward the request response to it. So that's it. That's how you forward it to a JSP. But now I would need to give it the path to the JSP. The way we give the path to a JSP in a servlet in a Java web application is starting from webinf. So I would need to start from webinf. So the path, if we look at it, is, what is the path? Where is the login.jsp present in starting from webinf /webinf /views /login.jsp. That's basically where our JSP is in webinf views login.jsp, and I typed it in here, webinf views login.jsp. Now the servlet would redirect to the JSP. Let's see if it's working. Let's go to the browser and I would type in localhost colon 8080/login.do. There you go. You have the content coming out from the JSP. My first JSP, Yahoo from JSP. So you have your first HTML content output from your JSP. So in this step, we had actually created the login servlet by hand and then we made it redirect to a JSP. We use JSPs because in a JSP, it's easy to write HTML content. Earlier in the servlet, we had to do a lot of out.printlns to generate this content out. But in a JSP, you just keep writing HTML out and it would be output, it would be sent back in the response to the browser. As in a lot of things, the first steps in developing a web application are the most difficult ones. You have now completed 2 steps, and these 2 steps, in my perspective, are the most difficult steps to take. And from here on, it will be an easy ride. Let's get going. Until the next step, bye-bye. The best way to learn something is by developing a playful attitude towards it. Now that you completed the first 2 steps, I would really recommend you take a break and play around with this particular code that we already have. What would happen if I change the URL pattern to login.do? Would the thing continue working? What would happen if I change the JSP to a non-existing JSP, if I change it to login1.jsp? If you are new to Eclipse, then you can try and play around with the imports as well. How is Eclipse getting the import directly when I go somewhere and type in control space? So I went into servlet exception, press control space, and the import automatically comes in. How does it happen? Try and play around with these things. There are a lot of new things that we are talking about in this particular steps, in the last couple of steps especially, and the best way to get good knowledge about them is play around with it. Play around with the URLs, play around with the JSPs, play around with the login servlet and see what more knowledge you can gain through that. We have configured the Tomcat plugin to automatically restart or reload the context if there's a change. That's why you would see that when I change something in here, I'm changing login.do to login1.do and pressing save, then you would see that in the console that the context will be reloaded. So now you see that the context is reloaded. Same thing if I change anything in the servlet, login1.jsp for example, the context would be reloaded. This would save you a lot of time. Because of this, you don't really need to restart the server each time. So you don't need to stop and start the server whenever you make changes in the servlets. The only time you need to restart the server is when you create new servlets or make major changes in there. For all the minor changes, those would be automatically loaded into the Tomcat server. For example, now let's get it back to login.do and I'm leaving the JSP as login1.jsp. As we know, the login1.jsp is not present. We only have a login.jsp, we don't have a login1.jsp. So what would happen? Aha! We get a HTTP status 404. It says webinf login1.jsp not found. The requested resource is not available. That's the error. So it means that the change we have done is deployed. That's one thing. The other important thing is the HTTP status. Along with the request, when I send a request to a server, I get a response back. One of the major things which is present in a response is something called the response status. In here, when I have a page not found, I got a 404. This means it's a page not found. Let's change it back to login.jsp, wait for the context to reload. Yeah, it's done. And do a refresh. You'd see that the response status is 200. So that's another important thing, the response status. The response status for a successful response is 200. Usually it's 200. And when there's a failure, the response status can be a different number. When it's a page not found, it's usually 404. That's why 404 is a famous status. A lot of techies use 404 to signify that something is not really found. In this small chapter, We just wanted to take a pause and look around and see what other things that you can learn about the application that we have already developed. I will see you in the next step. Let's now move on to our next step. We have a login.do login servlet created, which is redirecting to a login JSP. When we type in the login.do URL, my first JSP is coming up, and you can see the response, and also you can see the headers and the params in your browser. That's what we have done until now. One thing you would have already noticed is the fact that when I type in localhost 8080, also the same response is coming back. So even when I type in localhost 8080 and localhost 8080/login.do, we are getting the same response back. How is it happening? The answer to that is in your web.xml. In the web.xml, we configured a welcome file as login.do. What our web server would do is whenever there's a request with nothing behind it, so when there is a request with nothing behind it, what it would do is it would automatically forward to login.do. So this forward would happen automatically, and that's why you would see even when I type in a URL without login.do, my first JSP is automatically print. In this step, what we would discuss is something called a get parameter. How do we pass parameters to the request? One of the ways I can pass a parameter to the request is by using a get parameter. How do we do that? The way you pass in a parameter is by putting a question mark and giving a name of the parameter first. The name of this parameter, I would call it name, and I would pass in the name. So I'll say 28 minutes is the name. So when I do this, let's see what happens. Name is equal to in 28 minutes. Effectively, the URL you would be typing in is localhost :8080. Don't forget the HTTP in here, because sometimes Firefox is taking you to Google instead of bringing our web application up. So it's HTTP://. So that's where it starts. Localhost 8080 is where our web application is deployed. I'm creating a parameter by name, and the value I'm passing in is in 28 minutes. And the question mark is to separate the URL from the parameters. So what I'm doing is I'm separating the web server name and the servlet name from the parameters using question mark. So after question mark, you can pass any number of parameters. So now when I press enter here, you'd see that my first JSP comes in. There is no change because we have not used the parameter in our servlet code. So there is no change in the JSP, in the output from the JSP. But if you look at the request, you would see a few changes. I'm going to the request. The way you can get here by is doing right click inspect element and going to the network tab. So go to the network tab and you should refresh the page again. You should see this get request. And if I go to the headers in this particular request, you'd see a few important things. The request URL is now the complete URL including the parameters that we passed. And this is a get request that we already know. This is a get request. We'll look at post request a little later. The status is 200. That means everything is fine. Along with the request, there is something called parameters. What are the parameters that were passed? The parameters which were passed as part of the query string. And what were the parameters? Name in 28 minutes. So name with a value in 28 minutes is a parameter that is passed along with this particular request. These are what are called request parameters. So the way I pass a get request parameter is by appending it after the question mark. Question mark name is equal to in 28 minutes. So name is a parameter. Now we have sent the parameter from the browser, but how do we use it from the servlet? That's what we are going to look at right now. So let's go back to our login servlet. In this servlet, we are not really using the parameter. Let's use it now. The way you can get a parameter from request is by using request.getParameter, and I would need to put the parameter name in here. So I would say request.getParameter name. Let's do a sysout. Not the best way actually. Ideally I should be using logger, but let's take a shortcut. Sysout, and I would put in the request.parameter name. Let's wait for this servlet to reload. It's reloaded now, and I would refresh this page. So now there's no change in what you see in here, but if we go to the console, you would see that the in 28 minutes is printed on the console. That's because we did a sysout.println request.getParameter name. In 28 minutes is printed in. Now let's pass in a different name just to make sure that we are actually picking up the name. I'm passing in a different name. Let's say I'm passing in Ritika, my daughter's name. What would happen? You'd see Ritika in here as well. We are passing request parameter from the browser and we are printing it on the output. So we see the request parameter on the servlet. So now I would want to pass this request parameter from the servlet to the JSP. So whatever value I'm getting in the servlet, I would want to pass it to the JSP. How do I do that? That's the next important thing that you would learn. The first thing which we learned is how we would pass a request parameter and see that in the servlet. That we have seen. We need to use request.getParameter name. So that gives me back name. So now in the name I have the request parameter value. What I want to do is now pass this name to the JSP. How do I do that? The way we do that is by using something called request attributes. In the request, you can put certain things as attributes, and those attributes would be available to the JSP. So in the servlet, what we would do is we would put an attribute into the request, and in the JSP, we would take the attribute from the request and show it in the page. You have to differentiate between a parameter and an attribute. Get parameter is what you are passing in here. So the parameter is what is passed between the browser and the web application server. So from the browser, the parameter comes in to the servlet. The servlet takes the parameter and puts it as an attribute into the request so that the JSP can see it. How do I put it as an attribute? So you can say request.setAttribute, the name of the attribute. I'll use the same name, and then you can put in a value. So the value I would put in is name as well. So now I'm setting an attribute into the request. What's the name of the attribute? It's name. Now in the JSP, once I have put something in the request, put an attribute in the request, and I forward it to the JSP, the attribute would be available in the JSP. Let's directly refer to that attribute in here. The way you take the value of the attribute is by using $ open brace name and close brace. That's how you access the name in the JSP. Let's now reload the page and see what comes up. There you go. You'd see localhost :8080 name is equal to Ritika, my first JSP Ritika. That whatever you pass in here would be printed out in here. So my first JSP in 28 minutes. There you go. In this step, we actually passed in a parameter, a request parameter from the browser to the servlet, and we also passed it from the servlet as an attribute, as a request attribute to the JSP, and in the JSP we used something called expression language. This particular thing, $open brace and the close brace, is called an expression language. The expression language is used to dynamically pick up content from request, session, and other things. We will talk about expression language a lot more in further steps. In the next theoretical chapter, let's learn something about the JSPs. We'll talk about scriptlets and expression language. As we discussed earlier, a JSP is nothing but a servlet. What we were doing in the login servlet is we were redirecting to this JSP, and actually internally this login.jsp would be converted into a servlet. Everything that you can do in a servlet, you can also do in a login.jsp. You can actually write a lot of Java code in the JSP. This is not really recommended stuff, but it's good that you know it's possible. So let's write some Java code in the JSP. The way we do that is by doing something called scriptlets. In a JSP, anything that you write in within these two things is called a scriptlet. So let's try. Let's do a system.out.println in here. System.out.println dummy. Execute the request again and let's see our console in Eclipse. You'd see that whatever we have put in here is being printed. So if I change this to dummy2 and refresh, you'd see that dummy2 is printed to the console. That's very good. So you can write Java code in the JSP. This is called a scriptlet, and even things like I would want to, let's say, get the request parameter. So let's say I would not want to print dummy2, but I would want to say request dot get parameter. What is the parameter that we are passing in? Name. Let's see what happens now. So refresh. I'm passing in the name as in 28 minutes. What would be printed on the console? In 28 minutes, because that's the request.parameter. There are a few implicit things available like request session. Request is one among them. So we can use request to get the parameter name. So what we are doing in here is writing a lot of Java code. I mean, you can even do loops int I is equal to 0. I mean, anything that you can do in Java, you can do it in here. Let's print current time. So java.util.date. Date is equal to new java.util. And if I want to print the value of date, I can also do something like this. In HTML, we use divs to format code. So I'll use a div in here, div/div, and say current date is, and I want to print the value of the variable date. We can use a scriptlet expression to do that. So I want to print the value which is written by date. So this is how I can do that. So what we have done is we have created a variable called date, and I'm doing current date is date. Let's refresh and see what happens. So you can see that current date is Thursday, December 31, 10:56 IST. That's what is printed in here in this particular div. You can even do imports in here. Let's say I remove the java.util from here. In Eclipse, you can do a control space and it shows the options. I want to use java.util. You'd see that in the first line, an import is added in. Similar to a Java import, in a JSP, you import using page. So at page, import is equal to whatever classes that you would want to import. The same rules which apply to importing in a Java class applies to the importing in a JSP. What we are seeing effectively right now is the fact that in a JSP, you can write a lot of Java code. This is called a scriptlet. Here we are using something called a scriptlet expression. This piece of thing is called an expression language. Now, you know what is possible. You can write Java code in a JSP, but JSP is a view. You should only show information. You should not have any business logic. The moment you have a lot of Java code in a JSP, a lot of business logic tends to creep in. And to avoid it, we will not use any Java code in any of our examples in the JSP. We will not use scriptlets, neither we would use scriptlet expressions. All that we would be using is things called EL, expression language, which is things like this, $open brace, and we would use something called JSTL. It's a set of tag libraries, standard tag libraries, which we would be using. We will not use scriptlets and scriptlet expressions in this particular course. Neither do we recommend to use scriptlets in any real world application. Scriptlets is a very, very bad practice, and we would recommend to avoid using scriptlets in all the web applications. The best place to put in your business logic is in your business layer. This servlet controls the flow and the JSP is a view. So in the view, you would not have any Java code. All that you would need to do is to take something and show it. And that kind of things can easily be done by using expression language and also JSTL. That's a little bit of theoretical background on EL, scriptlets and scriptlet expressions. Now that you have this knowledge, you are ready to go into step 4. As you already know, the code for all the steps is present in GitHub in the repository in 28 minutes Java web application step by step. We are now looking at step 4. In this step, we want to add another get parameter password and also discuss about the disadvantages of using get requests. I'll go to the login servlet. Now, I would want to be able to accept another parameter by the name password. So along with the name, I would want to also accept another parameter called password. What I'll do is instead of creating a variable name, I'll remove that and directly put request.getParameter name in here. So I'll remove this line of code. So now there is request.setAttribute name comma request.getParameter. Similar to that, I would want to be able to access a parameter called password. So request.setAttribute password, and how do I get the password? From the request as well. So password, and now I can pass this value in. In addition to name, I can say another parameter. How do you pass in the second parameter? The way you pass in a second parameter is by putting an and the second parameter name. So password is equal to some password. This some dummy value I'm passing in. Make sure that you are typing in http:// as well. So the entire URL is http:// your web server name port name. The first parameter name is equal to in 28 minutes. The second parameter password is equal to some password, and these two parameters are separated by and the parameters are separated from the URI by question mark. This is the URL format. Now I would type this in, and there's nothing changing in here because we only added the request attribute password, but we have not taken it and shown it in the JSP. So let's do that as well. So let's quickly say my name is name and password is $password. Once I do this and I would now refresh the page, you'd see that my name is this and the password is some password. I'll do a right click, inspect element to see what are the parameters which are passed. I'll go to the network tab and reload, and now you'd see the get parameters. The request URL is localhost 8080, name is equal to in 28 minutes and password is equal to some password. And also you would see in the params there are two params, name and password, that are being passed. And the response that we get back is the content from the JSP. In the JSP we are using EL to replace the values, and we are creating the entire HTML in the JSP. HTML is written back to the browser and the browser displays this in here. The important thing in here is for something as sensitive as a password, if we are sending it as a get parameter, it is sent in the URL. Internet is basically a huge number of routers and computers tied together. Whenever you access a website, let's say I access google.com, actually the request for that particular website would pass through n number of routers. So anybody in the router can see the URL that you are passing in. So if I use get parameter to pass my password, any of the routers would be able to see what is the information I am passing in. And that's not really secure because anybody from then on can use the password that I am sending in to fire in another request. If the parameters are passed inside the URL itself, that's not really a secure way of doing it. And in get, that's the only way you can pass in parameters. And that's the reason why there is another HTTP request method which is present, which is called post. We will discuss that more in the next step. Until now, we have passed in a couple of request parameters, name and password, and we saw that this is not a really secure way of doing it because all the routers and probably the internet service providers would be able to see what information I'm sending as part of the URL. We can use a form and create a post request to send information more securely. It's not really completely secure because if we want to be really secure, we would need to do something called HTTPS and a lot of things like that. But for a start, using a form and using the post method is much better than sending parameters as part of the get request. So let's try and shift towards using a post request. We'll create a form first. As a first step, we would create a form. So how do you create a form in HTML? The way you create a form is by using a tag called form. And in the form, you have to specify the action. So who would handle this form? So the form request, we would want to send it to login.do, because login.do would handle this particular form. In this form, I would want to initially add in just the name. I will not worry about the password initially, so I'll just say enter your name. And to accept the value which is entered in, I would create a input element. So the input element, I would want to accept some input element, so I would type would be text. And I would need to give a name to it. The name that we would give is name. So I'm creating an input element with type text and name is name. So now enter your name and there's a text box. That's what we have created until now. So input type is equal to text and name is equal to name. And next we would need a submit button. So input type is equal to submit. So what we have done is we created a small form. In the form, I've put in the action as /login.do because I would want this particular request to go to the login servlet. So when user clicks submit, who do I want to handle this request? I would want the login servlet to handle this request. So action is equal to login.do, and you see that enter your name, type is equal to text, and then I'm creating a parameter name. So I'm creating an input text with a name, and also I'm creating a submit button. When submit button is clicked, this particular form would be submitted. So let's go ahead and try and see what comes up. When I type in, it says enter your name, and the name which is coming in is submit query. I don't like that. So you can customize that. So you can say value is equal to login or submit, whichever way you would want to. So now enter your name and login. I'll remove this text, my name is $name and password is password, because I don't need it anymore. We'll get that input from the user in the text box. Let's refresh the screen. So now you have enter your name and you have login. Now I would go and enter my name in here. Let's say I enter Ranga K and do login. What is happening in here is once I enter a name and press login, you'd see that actually the request parameter is sent as part of the URLs. Even now, even though we created a form, it's still creating a get request. So let's check that up again. So in the network tab, let's go ahead and let's type in a name, Ranga K, and press login. And you'd see that the request which is sent in still is a get request. So even after we created the form, the request which we are sending in even now is a get request and not really a post request. How do I really make this request a post request? The second thing you would observe is also that the parameter name. So whatever I'm entering as value in here is passed as the parameter. So it's passed in as with the name which we gave it and also the value which we are giving in as a parameter. So this is good. The value is getting passed. That's very good. But the thing which we don't like is the fact that this is getting passed as part of the URL as a get parameter. We would want to make it a post parameter. How do we do that? The way we do that is by using a method on the form. The method we want to use is post. Now I would go and now I would actually go to login.do and do a refresh. The page is loaded up. Now if I look at the response which came in, it has a method of post. So if you look at the form, it has a method of post. So it's the latest code which is coming through. So now I'm typing in my name, Ranga K, and pressing login. You can see now that we are sending a post request. If you look at the method in here, post request, we are getting an error. We are getting a server error, method not allowed. That's basically response status 405, which says the post method is not allowed on this particular servlet. So what this error is telling us is that on this particular servlet login.do, the post method is not really allowed. Why is it so? Let's look at the code. In the login.do servlet, which is login servlet, we only have a doGet method. We don't really have a post method. So we need to handle the do post as well. How do we do that? We will take care of creating a do post and doing more with it in the next step. So in this step, what we have done is we have created a very, very simple form. So we created a form. We have an action login do, and inside the form we have a text field with the name, and we have a submit button with the name login. And when you submit this form, we are sending a post request. And if you see the content of this particular post request in the params, you'd see that inside the form data, we are sending name Ranga K. So whatever we have inputted in the text box is going as part of form data. Earlier, when we sent the name, we were sending it as part of the request URL. Now, we are sending it as part of the form data. So we are sending the name as form data using a post method to login.do. But the thing is, right now, the login.do is not good enough to handle that request. In the next step, we will enhance the login.do servlet to handle this do post request as well. Let's move on to the next step. We want to make the HTTP method post acceptable by the login servlet. Let's go to the login servlet. The login servlet, if we see it right now, it has a do get method and it's doing a request.set attribute. I don't need these anymore because I'm not getting them as part of the get parameters. So I'll remove these two lines of code. So all that the do get is doing right now is it's forwarding it to the login.jsp. So if I run this right now, when I do a login.do, there wouldn't be a problem. It would just be loading up the form that we have created. I entered my name, I would get an error. 405 HTTP method post is not supported. So how do I now get the post method to be supported? Let's get started. So the first thing I'll do is just put in something in here. Instead of do get, it's do post. As simple as that. And instead of redirecting it to the login.jsp, I'll redirect it to something called welcome.jsp. I don't want to redirect it to the same page, login. Once user enters a name and comes in, we would want to send him to a different JSP. I mean, what's the fun in showing the login page again, right? So let's create a new JSP. I'll go to the login.jsp, make a copy of it and call it welcome.jsp. Now we have a welcome.jsp. So let's not worry about everything in here. Title welcome. We don't need a login form, so I'll delete this form, and we don't need the import also. We are not using the import anyway in login as well. I'll go ahead and delete that. Control D is the shortcut for deleting something in Eclipse. Delete the complete line. I have a title, body. I'll just say welcome for now. We want to actually get the name and display in here, but for now we'll just show welcome. So now what I'll do is I'll reload the login.do page and it says enter your name. I'm going to enter Ranga K. Aha, there you go. A welcome page came up. And also if you look at the request which was sent, it's a post request and the form data contained name. So name is inside the form data, but if I look at the header, the request URL does not contain the name. And the request method which is used is post, and the status which came back is 200. That means the request went through fine. So what is happening now is this JSP which we have created, welcome.jsp, is working. In the do post, we are actually redirecting to the welcome.jsp. That's very good. So that's your first successful form. We have created a form, login.jsp, and in the form, we put the action in as login.do. Thereby, it's sending a post request to this method, and then we directed it to the welcome.jsp. We are not really displaying the name yet, but at least it's going to the JSP. Now, next we would start displaying a name here. How do we add the name? It's the same. We need to just add an attribute, request.set attribute. What's the name we want to use? It's a name, so I'll put it as name, and we need to pick up the parameter from the request. Whether it's a get parameter or a post parameter, there is no difference in how you would get it. It's still a parameter for a request, so you'd still use get parameter. So I'm saying get parameter name and set it as an attribute. I've put it into the request. So the thing came in the form data, the do post accepts it, it set it as an attribute name into the request. Now I need to take the attribute in the JSP and show it. So I now need to take the attribute from the JSP and show it. How do we do that? Do you remember it? It's dollar. We are using expression language, dollar open brace, close brace, and between them the name of the parameter. Welcome dollar name. Is it as simple as that? Let's reload the page. Login.do. If you look at it right now, we are sending a get. When you put an enter in here, when we refresh this page, we are sending a get, and we are just sending login.do. And if you look at the parameters, there would not be anything which are sent. Now I would go ahead and enter Ranga K in here. So I would now press login. You'd see that another request is created, which is post, and it's going to login.do. In the parameters, name Ranga K is sent, and you'd see that the JSP came back with welcome Ranga K. So the response which was sent, if you look at it, contains welcome Ranga K. So instead of the name, we sent in Ranga K. So now I can enter any name. I can say in 28 minutes, let's say, and in welcome in 28 minutes. The good thing is if I press enter also it would work, and you can look at the request and the response methods. I would like you to take a pause in here and look at the code in detail. Take a pause. The entire code for this particular step until this step is available on GitHub in the code step6.mv. So in 28 minutes Java web application step by step and code step6.md. If you go in there, the entire code for this example is present. So you can take the code including the login.jsp and the welcome.jsp. So you can take the code, run it, and make sure that you understand every bit of it. Also, I recommend you to play around with it, try to change certain things and play around with it and see what you can learn from it. Good luck. What is the use of a login form which does not accept a password? Let's try and add a password to this in this step. Let's do it a little quickly. So what we want is, this is name, and we want to have a password field as well. So I'll say password, and I would need to create a text field to accept the password. In HTML5 there is a type called password. So I'll use that type password, and I'll also give the name as password because the name of this particular field is also password. So its type is password because when I type something in a password field, it will not be visible. And the name which I'm giving to it is also password. So now I have a password in here. As a first step, let's actually just display the password. Ideally, this should not be done because, why do you want to display a password on a screen? So not really good thing to do, but just to say that we are able to pick it up, let's add it to the welcome.jsp as well. Welcome, and your password is $. So there you go. Now this is so simple to add in a field. Now if I go and refresh the screen, login.do, you see a name and a password, and I type in name as in 28 minutes, and I'll say some password and press login. Firefox asks me if I want to save my password. I'll say no, and the message which I get back is welcome in 28 minutes and your password is some password. Ideally you should not do this. You will never display a password on a website, but we just wanted to make sure that we are able to get the password correctly. Now that we added in the password, let's quickly add in some validation for the password and make sure that a user is valid before he comes in. So there are two kinds of flows possible. One is a valid user, right? So there's a valid user, he logs in, and that user we would want to send him to the welcome page. So valid user with the right password, we want to send him to the welcome.jsp, or it should be able. And invalid user, what do we do with him? Invalid user, if the ID and password is invalid, what do? We send him back to the login page, right? That's basically what we would do. We would send him back to the login page. That's the functionality that we would try and develop right now. So if it's a valid user, we'll go to welcome.jsp, and if it's an invalid user, we'll go back to login.jsp. What we would want to do is to find out if a user is valid or not. For that, I need to have a service. What I'll do is I'll create a new Java class. So I'll call it new class, and I'll say user validation service and say finish. And the user validation service will have a method. So it will accept, it's a public method, and it would return a boolean whether the user is valid or not. So it will say if a user is valid or not, and the name is user valid, and it accepts two inputs, string user and string. And now I'll have one set of user ID and password which is valid. So I'll say if user equals in 28 minutes and password dot equals dummy, return true. I'll say let's assume that this is the only set of valid user ID and password. In all other situations, we are returning a false back. This is a very simple service. Actually, this would be talking to some authentication service usually, which is in a database or which is really a authentication system to find out whether the user ID and password is fine. But here, because we are starting with web application development, we created a hard-coded simple user validation service. This validation service, it accepts if it's in 28 minutes or and dummy. If the user ID is this and dummy, then it's a valid user. And any other user for this particular system is an invalid user. So this is a quite a simple validation service that we built in. Now, we would want to make use of this in the login servlet. So what we want to do in the login servlet is in the post method, I'll do a right click, refactor, and extract local variable. And I'll give it a name. I'm getting the name from the request parameter, as well as I'll get the password as well. I'll call this pass. So all we are doing is we are taking from the request and putting it to a variable. Now I'm putting it to a variable so that I can pass it to the login service method. So we have actually created a user validation service. So what I'll do is I'll create an instance of the user validation service in here. So I'll say private user validation service is equal to new user validation service. I've created now the service. I would call the service from here. Service.is user valid. I need to pass in the name and the password. What does it return? It returns if the user is valid or not. So if is user valid. If user is valid, what do we want to do? If user is valid, we want to send him to the welcome JSP. That's what we decided earlier. So if user is valid, we will send him to the welcome JSP. Else, what did we want to do? We wanted to send him back to the login. So let's go ahead and do that. All that we have done in the last few steps is we created a user validation service. The user validation service has only one set of valid user ID and password. If that's met, then it returns true. Otherwise, it returns false. And in the login servlet, we created an instance of this particular service, and we are now using this particular service to validate if a user is valid. If the user is valid, we are sending him to the welcome JSP. He has entered the correct user ID and password, so he can go to the welcome.jsp. Otherwise, we are sending him back to the login.jsp. Let's see if this particular piece of code is working. I'll take the user ID from here in 28 minutes, and also I'll take the password from here, dummy, and use it and see if it's working fine. Aha, that's good. I'm going to the welcome.jsp and I can see the welcome screen. In the welcome.jsp, I'm printing the password. I don't want to see the password anymore on the screen. So let's remove the password from the welcome.jsp. So in the welcome.jsp, I don't need the password anymore. So let's just say welcome username. So let's do a refresh and it's only printing welcome in 28 minutes. That's really good. So login.do, I type in 28 minutes. Be careful with the case because we have actually made a case sensitive thing. So be careful with the case of in 28 minutes. So you copy in 28 minutes and the password is PASS. Oops, not PASS, it's DUMMY and press login. You'd go into the welcome page. Let's now try with invalid user ID and password. So in 28 minutes and some other password, login. It comes back to the login page. So if I enter an invalid user ID and password, it takes me back to the login page. That's really good, but I would really like to see a message in here. I would want to see a message which says something is wrong. You have done something wrong. You entered the invalid credential. Something of that kind needs to be printed in here. So let's add that functionality in too. So we want to add a message. What message do we want to add? We want to add an error message. So how do we send that to the JSP? From Servlet, if I want to send something to the JSP, one of the options is request. So request.setAttribute, error message. What is the error message? For now, I'll just hard code it in here. Invalid credentials. We have set the attribute invalid credentials in here, but we also need to show it on the login.jsp. Let's create a paragraph P and let's show the error message in here. Oops, it's not right. $. The thing which we used is error. It's case sensitive, so be very careful with it. And also, I'll put a font color is equal to red, just to show that it's an error message. I mean, this is not really perfect HTML, but we'll work on it very soon. So font color is equal to red, error message, and the username and the password. Let's see what happens now. Login.do, I enter in 28 minutes as the name and some wrong password. Aha, there you go. Invalid credentials is coming in right now. So now I type in 28 minutes and the correct password, welcome in 28 minutes. That's perfect. So now if I enter a wrong password, invalid credentials. If I enter the right user ID and password, I'll be logging in. That's really cool. So you have actually implemented your first real login form using post right now. In the next step, we would further enhance this functionality.